Well, that depends on what kind of therapy they practice. Remember, there are over 250 varieties. But we can start to simplify things a bit by dividing psychotherapies into 4 major types.
The first type is called psychodynamic or psychoanalytic therapy, which sees all behavior as driven or motivated by powerful inner forces. The sources of mental illness are found in early life traumas, conflict, frustrations, deprivations, and unresolved tensions.
I don't have time anymore to get anything done. I used to sew a lot, and I just never get to the sewing machine anymore. I don't know if the hours are shorter or what's happening.
Psychodynamic therapists seek to help patients recognize these hidden motivations and to institute ways of changing them. Hans Strupp of Vanderbilt University is a leading authority on psychodynamic therapy.
The key ingredients of psychotherapy are a patient who can work in therapy, a therapist who can work with this patient, and a relationship between the two that makes it possible for the two to work together over a period of time. The patient must be motivated to work in therapy. That means they must be willing to come, they must be willing to invest of themselves, they must be willing to put forth some work. And that's very different from a patient in any other kind of treatment. We expect the patient to play an active part. The therapist must be a good listener above all, and that means to try to immerse himself or herself in the inner world of the patient, to try to understand what gives them difficulties and where they're hurting. Psychotherapy is basically a human relationship. It is not a treatment in the medical sense or in the way treatment is ordinarily understood, where somebody administers a treatment to somebody, but it is a relationship in which the two work together and the result of which we hope results in an improvement in the patient's mental health.
It was Sigmund Freud who developed the psychodynamic perspective around the turn of the century in Vienna. In classic Freudian psychoanalysis, the adult's current problem must be explored among the symbols of the past. What makes the search particularly difficult for both patient and therapist is that in Freud's view, much of the contents of the human mind are unconscious thoughts that cannot be easily brought to the surface or verbalized because they are too threatening to self-esteem.
It's almost like I want to tell you what I'm feeling, but I'm afraid to.
Afraid?
Afraid because I'm not sure how you're going to react to it, and afraid that maybe you won't be with me either the way that my parents were.
The central task of the psychoanalyst, then, is to discover the unconscious motives that are driving the neurotic symptoms, and then carefully guide the patient to develop insights into the connections between those symptoms and the root causes that are buried in early childhood. In addition, emphasis is focused on the development of the ego.
I felt unloved. I felt left out. I felt...
Did you really feel unloved?
Yeah, and I guess it feels funny that you should ask me that, because I feel...
One of the basic techniques of psychoanalysis is free association, in which patients talk about anything that comes to mind, thus reflecting their unconscious thoughts. Other techniques include analysis of patients' resistance and defenses, and analysis of their dreams.
I was in a very large room in some house somewhere. I don't know where it was. Huge room with very high ceilings. I was sort of leaning up against a wall in the shadows, and you were there. You were in the middle of the room, and you were holding a very, very small baby.
After listening to and talking with the patient anywhere from 3 to 5 times a week for at least a year, and usually more, the therapist interprets the material that's been gathered and begins to help the patient gain insight into the origins of his or her present anxieties, tensions, and feelings of guilt.
Over the years, psychoanalysts have modified some of Freud's techniques, as well as his emphasis on infantile sexuality and aggressive fantasies. But the analyst's ambitious goals remain the same, changing the patient's personality structure and not just his or her symptoms. And that takes time and money and requires patients who are highly verbal. So psychoanalysis only reaches a tiny minority of those with mental disorders.
But there's another brand of this therapy which takes much less time.
By and large, what you find is an amalgam of rather short-term therapy that may last 6, 10, 15 hours, and a form of psychotherapy that is built on psychoanalytic ideas and principles, but which may last months, weeks. It may be intensive or less intensive, but the bulk of therapists today, mainly psychiatrists and clinical psychologists, practice this intermediate form of therapy, which is neither short nor is it formal psychoanalysis, which, as I mentioned, is just about dying out.
What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to begin to relax, and that's done by concentrating on one thing.
But what if we forget Freud's notion of excavating the past? Forget about unconscious processes or character. What if we stop worrying about the underlying causes and instead concentrate on the symptoms? For behavior therapists, the goal is to modify problem behaviors by applying the principles of conditioning and reinforcement. In other words, change the symptoms, the behavior, and the client will function more effectively. In this example, a therapist uses fear reduction strategy to help a young boy overcome his intense fear of dentists.
I'm going to hold that in my hand, and I'd like you to relax now. I'm going to hold it in 3 positions around your face. May I do that? Okay.
In your bedroom, Nana.
Some behaviors can be changed by teaching people opposing reactions, such as learning how to relax during a tense situation. Other times, patients can be taught entirely new behaviors and skills. Here, therapists train a girl to control her epileptic seizures.
Money in your head, and boom, you fall down. Oh, you forgot to tense. Karen, tell me, does anybody...
Behavior modification therapies, as they're called, use a variety of strategies both to extinguish behaviors that are non-productive or upsetting and to find sources of reinforcement in the client's current life that can increase more desirable behaviors. In this case, the reward or reinforcement is a pen.
That was a good one. That was a real good one. Get your eyes closed. Why don't you get yourself...
But what if the problem isn't so much our behavior, but how we think and what we think? What if we get into trouble because of our tendency to vividly imagine worst-case scenarios in whatever we do, anticipating failure and humiliation, which then triggers intense anxiety? Or maybe we give negative interpretations of everything we do, our attitudes, beliefs, and cognitive biases, setting up irrational and self-defeating expectations about how the world works and our place in it. What do we do then?
If that's our problem, we might want to consider cognitive therapy, first developed in the 1960s by psychologists such as Albert Ellis. Cognitive therapists teach their clients how to recognize and change unreasonable attitudes, false beliefs, and expectations of failure. Ellis calls his form of cognitive therapy rational emotive therapy, or RET. He described it this way in a television interview.
Common technique of RET, rational emotive therapy, because I want to play